What happened next in the quiet corner of Riverside Park will leave you speechless. When a young orphan approached a man feeding pigeons and asked him to teach him chess, neither of them knew they were about to change each other's lives forever. The man's true identity would shock the entire chess world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist hung low over Riverside Park as George Ford sat on his usual bench, a worn paperback novel resting in his lap and a small bag of breadcrumbs beside him. At 62, he had perfected the art of invisibility. His graying hair was neatly trimmed but unremarkable. His clothes were practical, a faded brown cardigan, comfortable walking shoes, and reading glasses that had seen better days. To any passerby, he was just another elderly man enjoying the peaceful solitude of early morning. But George carried secrets that would have stunned the chess world. He scattered the last of his breadcrumbs to the gathering pigeons, watching them peck and flutter around his feet with the same analytical precision he had once used to study chess positions. The park was his sanctuary now, a place where nobody recognized his face or whispered his name in reverent tones. Here, he was simply George, not the legend, not the champion, not the man who had dominated chessboards across 3 continents for nearly 2 decades. The sound of shuffling footsteps on gravel made him look up. A boy was approaching, maybe 12 or 13 years old, with sandy brown hair that looked like it hadn't seen a proper cut in months. His clothes were clean but obviously secondhand, an oversized jacket that hung loose on his thin frame, and sneakers that had been patched with duct tape. Most striking were his eyes. Intelligent, curious, but carrying a weariness that seemed far too mature for his young face. He stopped about 10 feet away from the bench, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, clearly working up the courage to speak. George pretended to return to his book, but he watched the boy over the rim of his reading glasses. The boy reminded him of himself at that age, all sharp angles and nervous energy, hungry for something he couldn't quite name. "Excuse me, sir?" The boy's voice was polite, but uncertain, with the careful pronunciation of someone who had been taught to speak respectfully to adults, even when those adults had disappointed him time and again. George looked up, raising an eyebrow in what he hoped was an approachable expression. "Yes, son?" The boy took a hesitant step closer, his hands fidgeting with the zipper of his jacket. "I'm sorry to bother you, but—" He paused, glancing around the nearly empty park as if checking for witnesses to his request. "I was wondering if could you teach me how to play chess?" The question hung in the air between them like a perfectly timed chess move, unexpected, bold, and somehow inevitable. George felt something shift in his chest, a flutter of recognition that had nothing to do with being discovered and everything to do with seeing a kindred spirit. He closed his book slowly, buying himself time to process the moment. Of all the requests he might have expected from a young stranger in the park, this wasn't one of them. "Chess?" he repeated, his voice carefully neutral. "That's quite specific. What makes you think I know how to play?" The boy's cheeks flushed pink, and he pointed toward the small corner of the bench where George kept his belongings. Partially visible beneath his cardigan was the edge of a pocket chess set, a worn wooden box he carried everywhere but rarely opened anymore. He had forgotten it was showing. "I saw that," the boy said, his voice gaining a little confidence. "And you were watching those 2 old men play yesterday. You kept shaking your head when one of them made bad moves. I figured you must know the game pretty well." George was impressed despite himself. The boy was observant. A crucial skill in chess and in life. He had indeed been watching Harold and Frederick's daily game the previous morning, and he had been unconsciously critiquing their amateur mistakes. Most people would never have noticed such subtle reactions. "You're very observant," George said, adjusting his position on the bench to face the boy more directly. "What's your name?" "Tommy," the boy replied quickly. "Tommy Brennan. I live at Maplewood Children's Home, just a few blocks from here." He gestured vaguely in the direction of the residential area beyond the park. "We're allowed to come to the park on weekend mornings if we promise to be back for lunch." George nodded, understanding flooding through him. An orphan, that explained the careful politeness, the worn but clean clothes, the mature way he carried himself. George had met many children like Tommy during his years of charity exhibitions, Kids who had learned early that life wasn't fair, but who still believed it might surprise them if they were respectful enough, smart enough, good enough. "And why chess, Tommy?" George asked gently. "There are other games, other hobbies. What draws you to chess specifically?" Tommy's eyes lit up, and for the first time since approaching him, the boy seemed to forget his nervousness. "I saw it in a movie once. This really smart guy was playing, and he could see all these moves ahead, like he was seeing the future. And I thought—" He paused, looking down at his shoes. "I thought maybe if I learned to think like that, to see patterns and possibilities, maybe I could figure out how to make my life better, how to be smarter about things." The honesty in his voice hit George like a physical blow. He recognized that hunger, that desperate belief that chess might be the key to unlocking a better version of yourself. It was the same feeling that had driven him to practice 8 hours a day as a teenager, the same conviction that had carried him through countless tournaments and eventually to the world championship title he had held for 7 consecutive years. George studied Tommy's face, seeing past the awkward adolescent exterior to the sharp mind underneath. There was something special about this boy. He could sense it in the way he held himself, in the precision of his observations, in the thoughtful way he chose his words. "Sir," Tommy said suddenly, then corrected himself with a slight smile. "I mean, would you consider it? Teaching me? I don't have any money to pay you, but I could help you with things around here. Carry your groceries, clean the bird mess off the bench, whatever you need." George felt the last of his resistance crumble. This boy had no idea who he was talking to, no conception that he was asking one of the greatest chess minds in history to be his teacher. But perhaps that was exactly what made the moment so perfect. He wasn't asking George Ford, the legendary grandmaster. He was asking George, the man on the park bench who fed pigeons and read worn paperbacks. For the first time in years, George felt the familiar thrill of possibility, the electric moment before a brilliant game begins, when anything might happen and the board holds infinite potential. "Well, Tommy Brennan," he said, reaching for his pocket chess set, "I suppose we could start with the basics." Part 2, the first lesson, and Tommy's background. George watched as Tommy's eyes widened at the sight of the chess set. The wooden pieces were clearly handcrafted, each one smooth from years of handling, their surfaces worn to a soft sheen that spoke of countless games. What Tommy couldn't know was that this particular set had traveled with George to tournaments in Moscow, New York, London, and Mumbai. It had been his constant companion during the most glorious years of his career, when his name was whispered in chess clubs from Iceland to India. "These are beautiful," Tommy breathed, reaching out tentatively before pulling his hand back. "Are they really old?" "They've seen a few games," George replied with deliberate understatement, unfolding the worn leather board. The crease marks told their own story. Thousands of games, hundreds of victories, moments of triumph and despair that had shaped not just George's career, but the entire landscape of modern chess. Tommy settled cross-legged on the grass beside the bench, his posture unconsciously mirroring that of a devoted student. George recognized the hunger in his expression, the way his eyes tracked every movement of his hands as he began arranging the pieces. He had seen that same intense focus in his own reflection years ago, back when he was just Georgie Ford, a scraggly 14-year-old from the blue-collar neighborhoods of Detroit, dreaming of escaping his circumstances one move at a time. "Tell me about yourself, Tommy," George said as he placed the pieces on their starting squares. "What's life like at Maplewood?" Tommy shrugged, but George caught the slight tightness around his eyes. "It's okay, I guess. Better than some places I've been. Mrs. Patterson, she runs the home. She's fair. We get 3 meals a day, clean clothes, and they make sure we go to school." He paused, picking at a blade of grass. "Most of the other kids are younger than me. They still think someone's going to adopt them. And you don't?" "I'm 13, Tommy said matter-of-factly. "People want babies, maybe little kids. Nobody's looking for a teenager who's been in the system for 8 years. There was no self-pity in his voice, just the stark realism of someone who had learned to accept hard truths early. George felt a familiar ache in his chest. He remembered his own childhood loneliness, though his circumstances had been different. His father had left when he was 6, leaving his mother to work double shifts at the auto plant, while George spent his afternoons at the community center, teaching himself chess from a book with missing pages. The hunger for something more, something better, was a feeling he knew intimately. 8 years, he repeated softly. That's a long time. What happened to your family? Tommy's hands stilled on the grass. Car accident when I was 5. My parents were driving home from my mom's sister's house, and a drunk driver hit them head-on. My aunt couldn't take me. She had 4 kids of her own and barely enough money to feed them. So, state custody. He looked up at George with eyes that held no trace of self-pity. Could have been worse, though. I could have ended up with my dad's brother. He's in prison. The casual way Tommy delivered these facts told George everything he needed to know about his resilience. This boy had learned to compartmentalize pain, to focus on survival rather than dwelling on loss. It was a skill that served chess players well, though George wished he hadn't needed to develop it so young. You're very mature for 13, he observed, beginning to explain the basic setup of the chessboard. You have to be, in my situation, Tommy replied, then brightened as George pointed to the pieces. So these tall ones with the crosses on top, those are kings? Exactly. The most important piece on the board, but also the most vulnerable. The entire game revolves around protecting your king while threatening your opponents. George picked up the white king, feeling its familiar weight. Everything else is expendable in service of this one piece. Tommy nodded solemnly, as if filing away not just the chess instruction, but the life philosophy behind it. Kind of like how Mrs. Patterson protects all of us kids at the home. She's the most important person there, but she's also the one with the most to lose if something goes wrong. The observation was remarkably astute, and George found himself reassessing the boy sitting before him. Most beginners focused on the flashier pieces, the queen with her unlimited power, the knight with his unique movement. But Tommy had instinctively grasped the deeper strategic concept that chess was fundamentally about protection and sacrifice. That's a very sophisticated way to think about it, George said, genuinely impressed. Have you ever played any strategy games before? Just checkers and some card games with the other kids. But I like puzzles, word searches, Sudoku when I can find them in old magazines. I like figuring out patterns. Tommy traced the squares on the chessboard with his finger. This seems like the ultimate pattern game. George smiled, remembering his own first encounter with chess. He had been older than Tommy, 16, when he discovered the game that would change his life. A new volunteer at the community center had started a chess club, and George had joined more out of boredom than genuine interest. But from the moment he learned how the pieces moved, he was hooked. The infinite complexity hidden within seemingly simple rules, the way tactical combinations could emerge from quiet positional play. It was like discovering a secret language that spoke directly to his soul. Sadie? Pattern recognition is crucial in chess, George agreed. But so is intuition, creativity, and psychological understanding. Chess is often called a war game, but I've always thought of it more as a conversation between two minds. Tommy's eyes lit up. A conversation without words. Exactly. George felt a thrill of recognition. This boy understood concepts that took some players years to grasp. Each move is like a statement or a question. You're constantly trying to understand what your opponent is thinking while hiding your own intentions. Like poker but with complete information, Tommy added, demonstrating yet again his ability to synthesize new concepts quickly. George set up the position again, this time more slowly, explaining each piece and its movement. Tommy absorbed every word with the intensity of someone who had learned that knowledge was power, that understanding the rules of any game, whether chess or life, was the first step toward changing your circumstances. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting dappled shadows through the oak trees that lined the park, George found himself genuinely enjoying the teaching process for the first time in years. During his competitive career, he had occasionally given simultaneous exhibitions or charity lessons, but those had always felt like obligations, performances for the chess world that expected its champions to give back. This was different. Tommy's genuine curiosity and rapid comprehension reminded him why he had fallen in love with chess in the first place. So the queen is the most powerful piece, Tommy said, carefully moving the white queen forward. But the king is the most important. And these little ones in front, the pawns, they can become queens if they make it all the way across? That's right. Never underestimate a pawn, Tommy. Sometimes, the smallest piece on the board can change everything. Tommy looked up at him with a smile that transformed his serious face. Kind of like how sometimes the smallest person can make the biggest difference? George felt his breath catch. Without realizing it, this orphan boy had just articulated the philosophy that had driven his entire career. The belief that your starting position didn't determine your ultimate destination. That with enough skill and determination, even the most humble beginning could lead to extraordinary achievements. Exactly like that, he whispered, wondering if Tommy had any idea how perfectly he had just described both chess and life. Part 3. The routine develops and the crisis emerges. 3 weeks had passed since George first began teaching Tommy in Riverside Park. Their morning sessions had become a cherished routine. Tommy would arrive precisely at 8 o'clock, his homework completed and his mind sharp from the walk through the crisp autumn air. George found himself looking forward to these encounters more than he had anticipated, watching Tommy's understanding of chess deepen with each lesson. But on this particular Tuesday morning, their peaceful world was about to be disrupted. "Tommy Brennan!" The voice cut through the morning tranquility like a blade. George looked up from the chess position they had been analyzing to see a stern-faced woman striding across the park grass, her sensible shoes making sharp clicking sounds against the concrete walkway. The woman wore a charcoal gray suit that screamed institutional authority, and her silver hair was pulled back in a bun so tight it seemed to stretch the skin around her temples. Tommy's shoulders immediately tensed, and George watched the confident young chess student transform back into a wary orphan. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said quietly, standing up with the automatic deference of someone accustomed to authority figures. Mrs. Whitmore stopped directly in front of their makeshift chess lesson, her cold blue eyes taking in the scene with obvious disapproval. She was tall and angular, with the kind of rigid posture that suggested she had never relaxed a day in her life. A county social services badge hung from a lanyard around her neck, catching the morning sunlight like a small shield. "You were supposed to be back at Maplewood 30 minutes ago for your educational assessment," Mrs. Whitmore said, her voice carrying the weight of bureaucratic annoyance. "Mrs. Patterson has been looking everywhere for you." George felt an instinctive dislike for this woman, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. There was something in Mrs. Whitmore's tone that spoke of someone who viewed children as problems to be managed, rather than people to be nurtured. "I'm sorry," Tommy said, his voice smaller than George had ever heard it. "I lost track of time. We were working on a chess problem, and I—" "Chess?" Mrs. Whitmore interrupted, her gaze finally focusing on George with undisguised suspicion. "And who exactly are you? I don't recall approving any mentorship programs for Tommy." George stood slowly, drawing himself up to his full height. At 62, he might not have the commanding presence he once had in tournament halls, but he still knew how to project quiet authority when necessary. "My name is George," he said simply. "Tommy asked me to teach him chess, and I agreed. We meet here in the public park." Mrs. Whitmore's expression grew even more pinched. "Are you a licensed educator? Do you have clearance to work with minors? Have you undergone a background check?" Each question was fired, like an accusation, designed to make George feel like he was doing something inappropriate. "I'm simply an older man teaching a young person a game," George replied calmly. "I wasn't aware that required special certification in a public park." "Everything requires certification when it involves children in state custody," Mrs. Whitmore snapped. She turned back to Tommy, who was staring at the chessboard as if memorizing the position for later. "Tommy, you know better than to engage with strangers without permission. This is exactly the kind of poor judgment that concerns your potential foster families." George felt his temper flare, though he kept it carefully controlled. "Poor judgment. The boy is learning a skill that will serve him for life. He's developing critical thinking, pattern recognition, and strategic planning. How is that poor judgment?" Mrs. Whitmore's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Chess is a luxury, not a necessity. Tommy needs to focus on practical skills that will help him function in society. He's 13 years old and will age out of the system in 5 years. He needs job training, not games." "Chess isn't just a game," George said, his voice carrying an edge that made Tommy look up with interest. "It teaches discipline, patience, and analytical thinking. These are precisely the skills that help people succeed in any field." "And what would you know about success?" Mrs. Whitmore challenged, her eyes taking in George's simple clothes and gray hair with obvious dismissal. "You're sitting in a park feeding pigeons and playing games with children. That hardly qualifies you to give life advice." The words stung more than George expected, partly because they contained a grain of truth. What was he, really, if not the champion he used to be? For the past 5 years, since his retirement from competitive chess, he had indeed been little more than an elderly man feeding pigeons and reading books. The fire that had once driven him to greatness had dimmed to barely glowing embers. But watching Tommy's face crumple with disappointment, seeing the way he unconsciously stepped closer to him as if seeking protection, George felt something fierce awaken in his chest. This bureaucrat, with her forms and regulations and narrow view of what constituted worthwhile education, had no right to dismiss Tommy's passion or George's ability to nurture it. "Perhaps you're right," George said quietly, beginning to pack up the chess set. "Perhaps I'm just an old man who doesn't understand the real world." Tommy's face fell completely. "George, no, please don't listen to her. The chess lessons. They're the best part of my week. I've learned more in 3 weeks than I have in months of regular school." Mrs. Whitmore stepped forward, placing herself physically between Tommy and George. "That's enough, Tommy. You need to come with me right now for your assessment, and I don't want to hear about any more unauthorized chess lessons. If you want to waste time on games, the children's home has checkers and Monopoly." "But chess is different," Tommy protested, his voice rising with desperation. "It's not just a game. George taught me about tactics and strategy and how every piece has value. He says even pawns can become queens if they just keep moving forward." Mrs. Whitmore's expression grew even more severe. "Life isn't a chess game, Tommy. In the real world, pawns stay pawns. The sooner you learn that, the better prepared you'll be for your future." She grabbed Tommy's arm with unnecessary firmness. "Now come along, we're already late." George watched helplessly as Tommy was led away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He turned back once to look at George, and he saw in his eyes the same resignation he had witnessed in too many children who had learned not to hope for good things to last. As Mrs. Whitmore and Tommy disappeared around the corner of the park, George sank back onto his bench, the chess set heavy in his hands. For a moment he felt every one of his 62 years, felt the weight of anonymity and irrelevance that had settled on his shoulders since leaving competitive chess. But then he thought about Tommy's words, about pawns becoming queens if they kept moving forward. Perhaps it was time for this particular pawn to remember what it felt like to fight. Part 4, the counterattack begins. George spent the rest of that Tuesday morning sitting on his park bench, staring at the spot where Tommy had been forced to abandon their chess lesson. The autumn leaves drifted down around him like discarded pieces from some cosmic game, and he found himself analyzing the position he now found himself in with the same methodical approach he had once applied to championship matches. Mrs. Whitmore represented everything George had come to despise about institutional thinking, the belief that dreams were luxuries, that children from difficult circumstances should be grateful for basic survival rather than reaching for excellence. It was the same narrow-minded philosophy that had told a young George Ford that chess was no career for a boy from the Detroit projects, that he should focus on practical skills like factory work or military service. But George had proven them wrong, spectacularly and repeatedly, and if he could help it, Tommy would have the same opportunity. By the time he returned to his small apartment that evening, George had made a decision that would have surprised anyone who knew his recent history of quiet retirement. He was going to fight for Tommy's right to learn chess, but he was going to do it properly, through the channels that Mrs. Whitmore claimed to respect so much. His apartment reflected his current desire for anonymity, modest furniture, no chess trophies or photographs from his competitive days, nothing that would identify him as anyone more significant than a retired mechanic or teacher. But in the bottom drawer of his bedroom dresser, wrapped in tissue paper and hidden beneath old sweaters, lay the proof of who he really was. George pulled out the folder with trembling hands, feeling the weight of memories as much as paper. Inside were certificates, newspaper clippings, and official documentation of a career that had spanned 3 decades and changed the landscape of American chess forever. World championship certificates in multiple languages, photos of him shaking hands with presidents and chess legends, articles proclaiming him one of the greatest strategic minds of his generation. At the top of the pile was his most recent credential, a certificate from the International Chess Federation authorizing him to teach and mentor at any level, anywhere in the world. It had been a farewell gift from the chess community when he announced his retirement, a gesture of respect for his contributions to the game. He had never expected to use it. The next morning, George dressed more carefully than he had in years. He chose his best shirt, a navy blue sweater that didn't have any visible wear, and shoes that actually matched. He combed his gray hair until it looked distinguished rather than merely neat, and even considered wearing the watch his sponsors had given him after his final championship victory. When he looked in the mirror, he could almost see traces of the man who had once commanded respect in chess clubs and tournament halls around the world. Maplewood Children's Home was a sprawling brick building that had clearly seen better days. The paint was peeling around the windows, and the playground equipment looked like it had been installed in the 1980s. But the grounds were well maintained, and George could see children's artwork displayed proudly in several windows. Whatever its limitations, this was clearly a place where people cared about the kids in their charge. Mrs. Patterson, the director, turned out to be everything Mrs. Whitmore was not. She was a round, warm woman in her 50s, with laugh lines around her eyes and flour stains on her apron that suggested she had been helping with breakfast preparation. When George explained his purpose, Mrs. Patterson listened with genuine interest rather than bureaucratic suspicion. "Tommy's told us all about his chess lessons," Mrs. Patterson said, leading George down a hallway lined with children's drawings. "He's been trying to teach the other kids what he's learned. It's the most animated I've ever seen him." She paused outside her office door. Mrs. Whitmore mentioned there were some concerns about unauthorized contact, but I have to say, the change in Tommy has been remarkable. He seems more confident, more engaged with his schoolwork. George felt a warm glow of vindication. Chess has that effect on young minds. It teaches them that their decisions matter, that careful thinking can overcome difficult positions. "That's exactly what Tommy needs to hear," Mrs. Patterson agreed, gesturing for George to sit in one of the comfortable chairs arranged around a small coffee table. "His file shows a pattern of withdrawal and resignation that concerns all of us. He's incredibly bright, but he's learned not to invest too much hope in anything good lasting." George nodded, recognizing the psychological pattern. He had seen it in himself at times, the protective mechanism of not caring too much about anything that could be taken away. "I'd like to continue working with him, if that's possible. I have credentials." He handed over the folder he had brought, watching Mrs. Patterson's eyes widen as she examined the contents. "George Ford," Mrs. Patterson breathed, looking up from a photograph of George receiving the World Chess Championship trophy. "You're George Ford, the George Ford." George felt a familiar mixture of pride and embarrassment. "I was, yes. I've been retired for several years now." Mrs. Patterson continued to flip through the certificates and articles, her amazement growing with each page. "Six-time world champion, winner of the candidates tournament 4 times, the first American to hold the title for more than 5 consecutive years." She looked up at George with something approaching awe. "And you've been teaching our Tommy chess in the park?" "He asked me to," George said simply. "He's remarkably gifted. With proper instruction, he could be truly exceptional." Mrs. Patterson set down the folder carefully, as if it contained precious artifacts. "Mrs. Whitmore is going to have a very difficult time arguing that Tommy shouldn't receive chess instruction from a 6-time world champion." George smiled for the first time in days. That was rather the point. The director stood up and walked to her window, which looked out over the playground where a dozen children were engaged in various activities. "You know, we've always struggled with enrichment programs here. The state provides for basic needs, food, shelter, education, but there's never funding for the extras that help children discover their talents and passions." "Chess doesn't require much funding," George pointed out. "A board, pieces, and someone who knows how to teach." "But it does require consistency," Mrs. Patterson said, turning back to George. "These children have experienced too much disruption in their lives. If Tommy is going to benefit from chess instruction, it needs to be reliable, long-term." George understood what was being asked of him. This wasn't just about a few pleasant mornings in the park teaching a bright boy how to move pieces around a board. This was about making a commitment to be part of Tommy's life, to provide the kind of stable, nurturing relationship that could genuinely change his trajectory. The weight of that responsibility was both intimidating and exhilarating. For 5 years, George had drifted through his retirement, feeling disconnected from the passionate engagement that had defined his competitive career. Now, suddenly, he was being offered a chance to matter again, to use his knowledge and experience in service of something more important than trophies or ratings. "I understand," George said quietly, "and yes, I'm prepared to make that commitment." Mrs. Patterson smiled, the expression transforming her entire face. "Then let's make this official. I'll need to process some paperwork, run your credentials through our system, But I think I can safely say that Maplewood Children's Home would be honored to have George Ford as our chess instructor. George felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the thrill of beginning a new campaign, the excitement of seeing an empty board full of infinite possibilities. Tommy had asked him to teach him chess, but he was beginning to suspect that he might end up teaching him something even more valuable about the power of hope and second chances. Part 5. The crisis deepens. That evening, George received a phone call that changed everything. He had just finished organizing his chess books, volumes he hadn't touched in years, but which would now become teaching tools, when the phone rang with the sharp urgency that suggested bad news. "Mr. George?" The voice was young, frightened, and barely above a whisper. "It's Tommy." George's blood ran cold. "Tommy? How did you get this number? Are you all right?" "Mrs. Patterson gave it to me. She said you came by today, that you're going to be our official chess teacher." There was wonder in his voice, but it was overshadowed by something that sounded like panic. "But Mr. George, I think I messed everything up." "What do you mean?" George sat down heavily, his mind immediately jumping to worst-case scenarios. Had Mrs. Whitmore found some way to block the arrangement? Had Tommy gotten in trouble for their unauthorized lessons? "After Mrs. Whitmore took me away from the park yesterday, she made me sit through this long meeting about appropriate relationships and maintaining boundaries. But that wasn't the worst part." Tommy's voice cracked slightly. "She said she's recommending that I be transferred to a group home in Millfield. It's 40 miles away, and they specialize in, quote, challenging cases." George felt the world tilt around him. "Challenging cases? Tommy, what exactly did you do?" "I told her she was wrong about chess. I told her you were teaching me important things, and that maybe if she learned to play, she'd understand why strategy and thinking ahead matter." Tommy's voice grew smaller. "I guess I got kind of heated about it." Despite the seriousness of the situation, George felt a surge of pride. Tommy had stood up for chess, for learning, for the value of intellectual growth in the face of institutional pressure. It showed courage and conviction that would serve him well in life, if he was given the chance to develop it. "When is this transfer supposed to happen?" George asked, his mind already working through possibilities and countermoves. "Friday, 3 days." Tommy was quiet for a moment, then added in a voice so soft George had to strain to hear it. "Mr. George, I know I only just met you, but these chess lessons, they're the first thing in my life that's ever felt important. Like I might actually be good at something that matters." The words hit George like a physical blow. He thought of his own childhood, growing up in a world that had little patience for a boy's intellectual ambitions when he came from the wrong side of Detroit. Chess had been his salvation, his proof that he could think and compete and win, despite what others expected of him. The idea that Tommy might be denied that same opportunity because of bureaucratic small-mindedness was intolerable. "Tommy," he said firmly, "I want you to listen to me carefully. You are not going to Millfield. We're going to fight this, and we're going to win." "But how?" "Mrs. Whitmore has all the power. She decides where kids like me go, and if she thinks I'm trouble." "She doesn't know who she's dealing with," George said, feeling the familiar fire of competition rising in his chest. "I've faced opponents far more formidable than Mrs. Whitmore, and I've beaten them all." There was a long pause, then Tommy asked quietly, "Mr. George, can I tell you something, but you have to promise not to think I'm crazy." "I promise." "Sometimes, when we're playing chess, when you're explaining the moves and the strategy, I feel like I'm talking to someone really important. Like you're not just a man who feeds pigeons in the park. Am I crazy?" George felt his heart skip a beat. Tommy's intuition was remarkable. He could sense the depth of his knowledge and experience even without knowing his identity. "You're not crazy, Tommy. You're very perceptive." "So who are you really?" George hesitated. He had kept his identity secret not out of shame, but out of a desire for the simple peace of anonymity. Revealing who he was would change everything. It would make their relationship about his celebrity, rather than their mutual love of chess. But Tommy was facing a crisis that might separate them forever, and he deserved to know that he had a champion in his corner. "Tommy, I need to tell you something, but not over the phone. Can you meet me at the park tomorrow morning, early, before anyone else is likely to be there? Mrs. Whitmore said I'm not supposed to. Mrs. Patterson gave me permission to teach you chess officially, That supersedes Mrs. Whitmore's restrictions. George's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Be there at 7 o'clock. And Tommy? Bring that book you told me about, the one that first taught you about chess. After hanging up, George sat in his quiet apartment, staring at the folder of credentials and accolades that would soon become weapons in a battle he hadn't expected to fight. Tommy's situation was worse than he had realized. He wasn't just being denied chess lessons. He was being punished for his passion, labeled as difficult for refusing to accept that his dreams were unrealistic. George understood that kind of labeling all too well. He had been called difficult, unrealistic, and inappropriately ambitious throughout his early career. Chess officials had questioned whether a boy from his background belonged in serious competition. Sponsors had been reluctant to support someone who challenged traditional expectations about who could become a champion. But George had proven them all wrong. One brilliant game at a time, he had shown that talent and determination could overcome prejudice and institutional resistance. Now it was time to do the same for Tommy. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. International Chess Federation, Martha Hendricks speaking. Martha, this is George Ford. I need a favor. The stunned silence on the other end told George that his reputation still carried weight in the chess world. When Martha finally found her voice, it was filled with excitement and curiosity. George, my God, we haven't heard from you since your retirement ceremony. How are you? What can we do for you? I'm teaching chess to a young boy who's in state custody. His caseworker is trying to transfer him away from me because she doesn't believe chess is a worthwhile use of his time. I need an official letter from the ICF stating the educational and developmental benefits of chess instruction for young people. Consider it done, Martha said immediately. George, I have to ask, are you thinking of coming out of retirement? Because if you're interested in coaching or teaching officially, we have programs that would… Let's focus on helping one boy first, George interrupted gently. But Martha? Make sure that letter emphasizes that chess instruction from a qualified teacher can be life-changing for a gifted child. After he hung up, George walked to his bedroom window and looked out at the city lights twinkling in the darkness. Somewhere out there, Tommy was probably lying awake in his narrow bed at Maplewood, worried about a future that seemed determined to crush his dreams before they could fully form. But George had spent his entire career proving that the most hopeless positions often contained hidden possibilities. Tomorrow, he would show Tommy that sometimes the best defense was a bold, unexpected attack. And Mrs. Whitmore was about to discover what it meant to face a six-time world champion who was fighting for something more important than any trophy. Part 6. The Revelation. At 7 o'clock sharp, Tommy appeared at their usual bench in Riverside Park, clutching a worn paperback book to his chest like a shield. George was already there, but this morning he looked different. Gone was the simple brown cardigan and comfortable walking shoes. Instead, he wore a tailored black blazer, elegant but understated, and his silver hair was styled in a way that suggested careful attention. Most notably, he carried a leather briefcase instead of his usual canvas bag. Mr. George? Tommy approached cautiously, clearly sensing that something fundamental had shifted. You look different. Sit down, Tommy. We have a lot to talk about before our chess lesson. Tommy settled onto the bench beside him, still holding his book. George noticed it was a children's introduction to chess, probably 15 years old, with pages that had been taped back into the binding and corners that were soft from handling. Is this the book that taught you about chess? George asked gently. Tommy nodded, his cheeks flushing slightly. I found it in a box of donations at the children's home 3 years ago. Most of the pages were there, and I taught myself the basic moves from the diagrams. He opened it carefully, revealing pages covered in pencil annotations and hand-drawn additions where pieces of text were missing. George felt his heart constrict as he examined Tommy's careful notes. He had painstakingly reconstructed missing information, drawing in chess positions where photographs had been torn out, writing his own explanations when text was incomplete. It was the work of someone who hungered for knowledge with desperate intensity. This is remarkable, Tommy. You essentially taught yourself chess from an incomplete textbook, and you did it well enough to understand advanced concepts the first time I showed them to you. It wasn't that hard, Tommy said modestly. I just kept reading it over and over until it made sense, and I practiced the positions in my head when I couldn't sleep. George opened his briefcase and withdrew a pristine copy of My System by Aaron Nimzowitsch, one of the foundational texts of chess strategy. I want you to have this. It's a proper chess book, and it will teach you things that your first book couldn't. Tommy's eyes widened as he accepted the volume. Mr. George, this looks expensive. I can't. Yes, you can. Because, Tommy, I need to tell you something about who I am. And after I do, you'll understand why giving you that book isn't charity. It's an investment. George took a deep breath, feeling as though he was about to step off a cliff. For 5 years, he had been just George, a quiet man who fed pigeons and read novels. But the crisis facing Tommy required him to become George Ford again, with all the recognition and responsibility that name carried. Tommy, my full name is George Ford. I was the world chess champion for 8 years, from 1994 to 2002. I won the championship 6 separate times and was considered one of the strongest players in the world for nearly 2 decades. Tommy stared at him in stunned silence, the book forgotten in his lap. You're George Ford? The George Ford? You know that name? Know it? Tommy's voice rose with excitement. Mr. George, you're famous. You're in my chess book. He flipped rapidly through the worn pages until he found what he was looking for, a brief sidebar about notable American chess players. There, in a grainy black-and-white photograph, was a younger George holding a trophy, his eyes bright with the fire of competition. George looked at the photograph of his younger self, remembering the moment it was taken, the 1994 World Championship final, when he had defeated the reigning champion in what many considered the most brilliant game of his career. He had been 31 years old, at the peak of his abilities, convinced that he could conquer any position the chess world could present. I read about you years ago, Tommy continued, his words tumbling over each other in his excitement. You were the first American to win the title since Bobby Fischer. You beat grandmasters who said Americans couldn't compete at the highest level anymore. You're like a legend. I was, George said quietly. But legends don't last forever. I retired 5 years ago, and since then, I've been just another elderly man living quietly. Tommy shook his head vigorously. No way. You can't stop being who you are just because you're not competing anymore. You're still George Ford. You still have all that knowledge, all that skill. George felt a warmth spread through his chest at Tommy's words. For 5 years, he had felt like a faded photograph of himself, disconnected from the passion and purpose that had once driven him. But sitting here with this earnest boy who looked at him with such admiration and respect, he began to remember what it felt like to be someone who mattered. Tommy, the reason I'm telling you this is because Mrs. Whitmore is trying to have you transferred to Millfield. She thinks chess is a waste of your time, and she sees your passion for the game as evidence that you're difficult to manage. Tommy's face fell. So it's really happening? They're really going to send me away? Not if I have anything to say about it. George opened his briefcase again and pulled out a thick folder. I spent yesterday making some phone calls and gathering some ammunition. Do you know what this is? Tommy shook his head, still looking shell-shocked by the revelation of George's identity. This is a letter from the International Chess Federation explaining the educational benefits of chess instruction. This is documentation of my credentials as a teacher and mentor. This is research showing that children who learn chess show improved academic performance, better problem-solving skills, and increased self-confidence. George's voice grew stronger with each item he listed. And this is a copy of an email from the mayor's office expressing interest in a chess program for at-risk youth. The mayor? Tommy's eyes went wide. I may have retired from competitive chess, but I still have friends in high places. The chess world is smaller than you might think. And George Ford asking for a favor tends to get people's attention. Tommy was quiet for a long moment, processing everything George had told him. When he finally spoke, his voice was small and uncertain. Mr. George, why are you doing all this for me? I'm just some kid from a children's home. You could be teaching chess to important people, famous people. Why do you care what happens to me? George felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. Tommy, do you remember what I told you about pawns? That they can become queens if they keep moving forward. Exactly, but there's something else about pawns that most people don't understand. A pawn is only as strong as the position it's in and the pieces that support it. Even the most talented pawn needs help to reach its potential. George reached over and placed his hand gently on Tommy's shoulder. "I see myself in you, Tommy. I see the hunger for knowledge, the natural understanding of strategy, the refusal to accept that your circumstances define your limits. 30 years ago, I was a boy from the Detroit projects who was told that chess wasn't for people like me. Someone believed in me anyway, gave me opportunities I didn't deserve on paper. And now you're doing the same for me." "I'm trying to, but Tommy, I need you to understand something. If we're going to fight Mrs. Whitmore and win, you can't just be a student anymore. You have to become a chess player. Really and truly, you have to be willing to work harder than you've ever worked, to study positions until your eyes burn, to accept criticism and learn from defeats." Tommy straightened his shoulders, and George saw a glimpse of the competitor he could become. "What do I need to do?" George smiled, feeling the familiar thrill of preparing for battle. "First, we're going to have a proper chess lesson. I'm going to teach you some openings and endgame principles that will lay the foundation for serious study. Then, this afternoon, we're going to walk into Mrs. Whitmore's office together, and we're going to show her exactly what happens when someone tries to separate a chess champion from his student." As George set up the chessboard on the bench between them, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the electric anticipation of a campaign beginning. Tommy might have started this journey as a lonely orphan asking for chess lessons, but he was about to discover what it meant to be mentored by one of the greatest strategic minds of his generation. The real game was just beginning. 3 hours later, Tommy sat across from George in the small conference room at Maplewood Children's Home, watching him arrange papers on the table with the methodical precision of a chess player setting up for a crucial match. Mrs. Patterson sat at the head of the table, while Mrs. Whitmore occupied the chair directly opposite George, her expression radiating bureaucratic disapproval. But Tommy's mind wasn't entirely focused on the coming confrontation. During their morning chess lesson, George had shown him something that had ignited his imagination in a way he'd never experienced before. It had started when George demonstrated a famous position from one of his championship games, a seemingly hopeless situation where he had been behind in material and facing what looked like certain defeat. But then he had shown Tommy the sequence of moves that followed, a brilliant combination that had turned apparent disaster into stunning victory. "Chess isn't just about the pieces you can see," George had explained as he moved the pieces through the combination. "It's about recognizing the hidden possibilities in every position, the potential for transformation that others miss." Tommy had felt something click in his mind as he watched the demonstration. It wasn't just understanding, it was recognition. He could see the patterns George was showing him, could feel the logic behind moves that seemed impossible at first glance. More than that, he found himself anticipating some of George's explanations, his intuition leaping ahead to grasp concepts before they had been fully articulated. "Try this position," George had said, setting up a complex middle game scenario. "White to move and find the best continuation." Tommy had studied the board, feeling the familiar rush of mental engagement that chess always brought him, but this time was different. This time he could sense layers of possibility that had been invisible to him before. The pieces seemed to whisper their potential moves, showing him combinations and counter-combinations that stretched several moves into the future. When he finally moved his knight to what looked like an inconsequential square, George had gone very still. "Tommy," he had said quietly, "do you see what that move accomplishes?" "It attacks the bishop, but that's not the real point," Tommy had replied, his voice growing more confident as he traced the implications. "If black takes the knight, then my queen can move to d5, and that sets up a discovered check that wins the rook. But if black doesn't take, then I can play knight to f6 next move, and that's an even stronger attack." George had stared at the board for a long moment, then looked at Tommy with an expression he couldn't quite read. "That's a master-level combination, Tommy. That's the kind of move that separates strong players from truly exceptional ones." Now, sitting in the conference room and watching Mrs. Whitmore shuffle through her own papers, Tommy felt that same sense of hidden possibilities. He could see the moves George was planning, could sense the strategy behind his careful preparation. But more than that, he was beginning to understand that this confrontation was about more than just his chess lessons. This was about whether someone like him was allowed to reach for excellence, or whether he would be shuffled off to Millfield to learn practical skills and accept limitations that others had decided were appropriate for his circumstances. Mrs. Whitmore cleared her throat, clearly eager to take control of the meeting. "Mrs. Patterson, I appreciate you arranging this meeting, but I have to say that I don't see how it changes anything. Tommy is scheduled for transfer to Millfield on Friday, and that decision was made based on his pattern of defiant behavior and unrealistic expectations. Unrealistic expectations? George's voice was calm, but Tommy caught the edge beneath it. Could you be more specific about what you consider unrealistic? Mrs. Whitmore consulted her notes. Tommy has expressed the belief that learning chess will somehow change his life circumstances. He's become argumentative when told to focus on age-appropriate activities, and he's developed an inappropriate attachment to unauthorized mentoring relationships. Tommy felt his temper flare, but George's slight hand gesture reminded him to stay calm. This was his game to play. I see, George said mildly. And what would you consider appropriate expectations for a boy of Tommy's intelligence and circumstances? Realistic ones, Mrs. Whitmore replied curtly. Tommy needs to understand that his future likely involves blue-collar work, possibly military service if he can maintain discipline. He needs practical skills, job training, basic life skills, not fantasy games that give him inflated ideas about his potential. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Tommy felt something cold and angry settle in his stomach. He looked at George and saw that he had gone very still, the way he had when studying the chess position that morning. Mrs. Whitmore, George said softly, are you familiar with my background? You're a retired man who has been giving Tommy unauthorized chess instruction, Mrs. Whitmore replied dismissively. I don't see how your background is relevant to Tommy's need for appropriate guidance. George reached into his briefcase and withdrew a single photograph, himself at 29, holding the World Championship trophy after his first victory, his face radiant with the joy of achievement against impossible odds. This is me in 1994, becoming the youngest American to win the World Chess Championship since Bobby Fischer, George said calmly. I was born in the projects of Detroit, to a single mother who worked double shifts at the auto plant. By your standards, Mrs. Whitmore, my expectations were completely unrealistic. Tommy watched Mrs. Whitmore's face change as recognition dawned. The bureaucratic confidence wavered, replaced by uncertainty and something that might have been embarrassment. Mrs. Whitmore began, then stopped, clearly struggling to process this new information. George Ford, George confirmed. 6-time world champion, author of 4 books on chess strategy, recipient of the Order of Merit from the International Chess Federation. I retired from competitive play 5 years ago, but I remain one of the most recognized names in chess worldwide. Mrs. Patterson leaned forward, her eyes bright with fascination. Mrs. Whitmore, do you understand what this means? We have one of the greatest chess minds in history offering to personally mentor one of our children. But Tommy could see that Mrs. Whitmore wasn't ready to concede. If anything, the revelation seemed to make her more defensive, more determined to assert her authority. That's impressive, Mrs. Whitmore said stiffly. But it doesn't change the fundamental issue. Tommy is a ward of the state with limited prospects. Filling his head with grandiose dreams about chess mastery is ultimately cruel. It sets him up for disappointment when reality intervenes. George's eyes flashed, and Tommy felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had faced down the world's best players and emerged victorious. Mrs. Whitmore, let me tell you about reality. Reality is that intelligence and talent exist everywhere, not just in privileged circumstances. Reality is that I have personally known dozens of world-class players who came from backgrounds far more challenging than Tommy's. Reality is that you are about to make a decision that could destroy a child's potential because you lack the imagination to see past his current circumstances. Tommy held his breath, watching the two adults face each other across the conference table like opposing forces in some cosmic game. He could feel the weight of his future hanging in the balance, could sense that everything, his chess education, his relationship with George, his dreams of becoming something more than his circumstances suggested, depended on what happened in the next few minutes. Furthermore, George continued, his voice gaining strength, I have something that might interest you. He pulled out a thick folder and set it on the table. This morning, I received a call from the Davidson Foundation. They provide scholarships for gifted children in chess. They're prepared to offer Tommy a full scholarship to their summer intensive program, valued at $15,000, based on my recommendation alone. Tommy's heart nearly stopped. A scholarship? George hadn't mentioned anything about a scholarship during their morning lesson. Mrs. Whitmore's composure cracked slightly. A scholarship for chess? That's a legitimate educational opportunity that could open doors Tommy never imagined, George finished. But only if he's allowed to continue developing his talent under proper instruction. Tommy looked around the table, seeing the exact moment when the dynamic shifted. Mrs. Patterson was practically glowing with excitement, clearly recognizing the magnitude of what George was offering. Mrs. Whitmore looked like someone who had just realized she was playing chess against a grandmaster while thinking it was checkers. But what fascinated Tommy most was the way George had orchestrated this entire confrontation. He had known exactly how Mrs. Whitmore would react, had anticipated every argument, and prepared countermoves that were both overwhelming and irrefutable. It was like watching a masterclass in psychological strategy. "I need to make some phone calls," Mrs. Whitmore said finally, her voice much smaller than it had been at the beginning of the meeting. "Verify these claims, discuss the situation with my supervisor." "Of course," George said graciously. "Mrs. Patterson, would it be possible for Tommy to stay at Maplewood while these verifications take place? I'd hate for him to be transferred to Millfield, only to have to be transferred back when the scholarship is confirmed." "Absolutely," Mrs. Patterson said immediately. "Tommy, you're staying right here." As the meeting broke up, and Mrs. Whitmore hurried away to make her phone calls, Tommy found himself alone with George in the corridor outside the conference room. He looked up at this man who had just changed his life with the force of his reputation and the weight of his belief in his potential. "George," he said quietly, "that scholarship, is it real?" George smiled, and for a moment he looked exactly like the young champion in the photograph. "It will be by tomorrow morning. The Davidson Foundation owes me several favors, and they're always looking for promising students to support." Tommy felt something break open in his chest, not breaking apart, but breaking free. For the first time in his life, he glimpsed what it might feel like to have someone with real power, real influence, fighting for his dreams instead of trying to convince him they were impossible. "Why?" he asked. "Why are you doing all this for me?" George placed his hand on his shoulder, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of years and wisdom and hard-won understanding. "Because 30 years ago I was a boy who loved chess but came from circumstances that made my dreams seem impossible. Someone took a chance on me anyway. They saw past my limitations to my potential." He paused, looking directly into Tommy's eyes. "But more than that, Tommy, I see in you the kind of natural chess intuition that can't be taught. What you showed me this morning, that combination you found, that's the mark of someone who doesn't just play chess, but thinks in chess. That's a gift that appears maybe once in a generation." Tommy felt the words sink into him like warm honey, filling spaces in his soul that had been empty for as long as he could remember. Someone believed in him. Someone with the knowledge and authority to recognize real talent thought he was special. For the first time since his parents died 8 years ago, Tommy allowed himself to believe that his life might become something extraordinary. Part 8, The First Tournament. 2 weeks after the confrontation with Mrs. Whitmore, Tommy found himself standing at the edge of something that terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. George had arranged for him to play in his first official chess tournament, the Regional Youth Championship, where he would compete against players who had been training seriously for years. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," Tommy confessed as they stood outside the community center where the tournament was being held. Through the windows, he could see dozens of young players setting up boards, their movements confident and practiced in ways that made his stomach flutter with nervousness. "Ready is relative," George replied, adjusting the collar of the polo shirt he had bought him for the occasion. "6 months ago, you didn't know how the pieces moved. Now you're playing at a level that most kids don't reach after years of study." Tommy nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on the scene inside. Some of the players looked impossibly young, 7- and 8-year-olds moving pieces with the assurance of experienced competitors. Others were clearly seasoned veterans despite their teenage years, discussing openings and endgames with the casual expertise that came from tournament experience. "They all look so professional," Tommy said. "And you look like someone who belongs here," George assured him. "Tommy, I want you to remember something. You're not here to prove anything to anyone else. You're here to test yourself, to see how your natural understanding of chess translates to competitive play." George had spent the past 2 weeks preparing him with an intensity that had surprised them both. Their daily sessions had expanded from 1 hour to 3, and George had introduced him to concepts that most players didn't encounter until they had been competing for years. More remarkably, Tommy had absorbed it all with a hunger that reminded George of his own early development. But there was something else happening in these preparation sessions, something that went beyond chess instruction. George was teaching Tommy how to think like a competitor, how to handle pressure, and make decisions when everything was at stake. He was teaching him, in essence, how to believe in himself. "Your first opponent will probably underestimate you," George continued as they walked toward the entrance. "You're new, you're from a children's home rather than a chess academy, and you don't have the expensive chess sets and designer chess bags that some of these kids carry. Use that to your advantage." Tommy stopped walking. "George, what if I embarrass you? What if I lose every game and everyone realizes I don't really belong here?" George turned to face him fully, his expression serious but kind. "Tommy, let me tell you something about chess and about life. The only way you can truly embarrass yourself is by not trying. Every strong player in history has lost games, lost tournaments, faced moments when they questioned whether they had any talent at all." He gestured toward the community center, where young chess players were visible through the windows, some laughing with friends, others studying positions on pocket chess sets. "Do you see those kids in there? They look confident now, but I guarantee you that every single one of them has sat crying over a chessboard at some point, wondering if they should quit. The difference between players who improve and players who plateau isn't talent. It's the willingness to keep playing even when you lose, even when you doubt yourself." Tommy absorbed this, feeling some of his nervousness transform into determination. "So it's okay if I lose?" "It's more than okay. It's necessary. You're going to lose games today, probably several of them. But you're also going to learn more about chess in the next 6 hours than you could in 6 weeks of casual play." George's voice grew warmer. "And Tommy, I have a feeling you're going to surprise some people." They entered the community center together, and Tommy was immediately struck by the focused energy that filled the space. Chessboards were arranged in precise rows, each with its own small placard indicating the round and board number. Tournament directors moved between the tables, checking equipment and answering questions. The walls were lined with demonstration boards where games from famous matches were displayed, and Tommy recognized several positions from the books George had been showing him. At the registration table, a woman with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses looked up their information. "Tommy Brennan," she read from her list. "First tournament." "Yes, ma'am," Tommy replied politely. "And you're being coached by—" She consulted her notes again, then looked up sharply. "George Ford? The George Ford?" George stepped forward with a slight smile. "Guilty as charged." The tournament director's demeanor changed immediately, shifting from routine politeness to something approaching reverence. "Mr. Ford, it's an honor to have you here. I followed your career throughout the 90s. Your victory over Karpov in the 1998 exhibition match is still talked about in chess circles." "You're very kind," George replied. "I'm here today simply as Tommy's coach. This is his day." Tommy felt a surge of pride at George's words, but also a weight of responsibility. He was representing not just himself, but George's reputation as a teacher. The thought was both intimidating and inspiring. "Tommy," the tournament director said, turning back to him with newfound interest, "you're quite fortunate to have Mr. Ford as your coach. I hope you realize what an extraordinary opportunity this is." "I do," Tommy said, and meant it. As they found seats near the tournament boards, George pulled out a notebook and opened it to a page covered with his handwriting. "I've been analyzing the likely players you'll face today. Most of them have been competing for several years, but they also tend to play predictable openings and follow standard patterns." He showed Tommy several sample positions, walking him through the typical strategies his opponents might employ. But what struck Tommy most was George's absolute confidence in his ability to handle whatever he encountered. "Remember," George said as the tournament director called for players to take their seats for the first round, "chess is a conversation. Listen to what your opponent is telling you with their moves, and respond with moves that express your own ideas clearly and forcefully." Tommy stood up, his legs feeling slightly unsteady. Around him, other young players were moving to their assigned boards with the casual confidence of experience. He found his board, number 23, and sat across from a girl who looked about his age, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and a chess bag that probably cost more than Tommy's entire wardrobe. "I'm Sarah," she said politely as they shook hands. "Good luck." "Tommy, you too." As Tommy arranged his pieces on the starting squares, he felt the familiar calm that always descended when he sat down to a chessboard. The nervousness faded, replaced by the focused attention that George had taught him to cultivate. This was just chess, the same game he had been falling in love with for months. But as he looked across the board at Sarah, who was consulting a small notebook filled with opening preparations, Tommy realized that this was also something entirely new. This wasn't practice or instruction. This was competition, where every move mattered and every decision had consequences. The tournament director called for play to begin, and Sarah immediately played 1.e4 with the confidence of someone who had made this move hundreds of times before. Tommy looked at the position, considered his options, and played 1c5. The Sicilian defense, one of the sharp, fighting openings George had been teaching him. Sarah raised an eyebrow slightly, clearly not expecting such an aggressive response from a first-time tournament player. She played 2, nf3, still following standard theory, but Tommy could see her studying the position more carefully than she had planned to. As the game progressed, Tommy felt himself settling into the rhythm of competitive play. Sarah was a solid player, clearly well-trained, but she played with the mechanical precision of someone who had memorized patterns without fully understanding the principles behind them. George's teaching had emphasized understanding over memorization, and Tommy found himself recognizing the weaknesses in Sarah's position even when she followed theoretical recommendations. On move 15, Tommy saw it, a tactical sequence that would win material and give him a decisive advantage. It was exactly the kind of combination George had been showing him, the type of pattern recognition that separated strong players from average ones. He played the move without hesitation and watched Sarah's confident expression crumble as she realized what he had done. 20 minutes later, Sarah extended her hand in resignation. "Good game," she said, but Tommy could hear the bewilderment in her voice. "How long have you been playing?" "About 6 months," Tommy replied honestly. Sarah stared at him as if he had just claimed to be from another planet. 6 months? I've been playing for 4 years. As Tommy walked back to where George was sitting, he felt something he had never experienced before, the intoxicating rush of competitive success, the knowledge that he had tested himself against a skilled opponent and emerged victorious. "How do you feel?" George asked, as he sat down beside him. "Like I want to play again right now," Tommy replied, surprising himself with the intensity in his voice. George smiled, and Tommy saw in his expression the same fierce joy he was feeling. That, Tommy, is the moment you become a chess player. Not when you learn the moves, not when you understand the strategy, but when you discover that you have the heart of a competitor. Looking around the tournament hall, Tommy no longer felt like an outsider looking in. He felt like someone who belonged here, someone who had found his calling in the ancient battle of minds, played out across 64 squares. The boy who had asked George to teach him chess 6 months ago was gone, replaced by someone who understood that he was capable of extraordinary things. And this was only the beginning. Part 9, Recognition and Rising Stakes. By the 4th round of the tournament, word had begun to spread through the chess community that something remarkable was happening at board 23. Tommy had won his first 3 games with a combination of tactical brilliance and positional understanding that seemed impossible for someone playing in his first tournament. George sat in the analysis area, ostensibly reading a chess magazine, but actually watching the growing buzz of attention around Tommy's games. Tournament directors were pointing him out to each other, parents were whispering about the mysterious new player, and several experienced coaches had begun studying his games with obvious fascination. "Excuse me, are you George Ford?" George looked up to see a distinguished man in his 50s approaching his table. He recognized him immediately. Drive. Richard Morrison, director of the prestigious Grandmaster Academy, and one of the most respected chess coaches in the country. "Richard," George said, standing to shake his hand, "I didn't know you were here today." "I came to scout a few of our academy students who are competing," Dr. Morrison replied, then leaned in closer. "But I have to ask, is that extraordinary young man at board 23 really your student?" George felt a surge of pride that surprised him with its intensity. "Tommy Brennan, I've been working with him for about 6 months." Dr. Morrison shook his head in amazement. "George, I've been coaching chess for 25 years, and I've never seen anything like what that boy just did in round 3. The way he sacrificed his knight to expose the enemy king, that was master-level calculation. Tommy has exceptional natural talent, George agreed. But more than that, he has the kind of chess intuition that can't be taught. How old is he? 13. Dr. Morrison was quiet for a moment, clearly processing the implications. George, if that boy continues developing at this rate, he could be a serious candidate for national youth teams within 2 years. Has he considered applying to specialized chess programs? George felt a familiar protective instinct rise in his chest. He had spent months building Tommy's confidence, helping him believe in his own potential. The last thing he wanted was for him to be overwhelmed by expectations and pressure before he was ready. He's still learning what he's capable of, George said diplomatically. Today is his first tournament. His first tournament? Dr. Morrison's voice rose slightly, causing several nearby players to look in their direction. George, that's impossible. Players don't develop that kind of positional sense without years of competitive experience. Before George could respond, a commotion arose from the tournament boards. They looked over to see Tommy's fourth-round opponent, a 16-year-old named Marcus Chen, who was ranked among the top junior players in the state, staring at the chessboard with an expression of complete disbelief. George and Dr. Morrison moved closer to observe the position, and George felt his breath catch as he recognized what Tommy had accomplished. In a complex middle game position, he had found a sequence of moves that most masters would be proud to discover. The combination was both beautiful and devastating, leaving Marcus with no adequate defense against Tommy's attack. Marcus played one more move, then resigned with obvious frustration. As the two players shook hands, George heard Marcus mutter, "Where did you come from? I've never seen you at any tournaments." "It's my first one," Tommy replied simply. Marcus stared at him as if he had just claimed to be a visitor from Mars. "Your first tournament? That's not possible. Nobody plays like that in their first tournament." A small crowd had gathered around their board now, including several tournament officials and coaches who had heard about the upset in progress. George watched Tommy handle the attention with remarkable poise, answering questions politely but without the false modesty that often characterized young players who hadn't yet learned to believe in their own abilities. "Tommy," he heard one of the coaches ask, "who's been teaching you? Which academy are you from?" "I'm not from an academy," Tommy replied. "George Ford has been coaching me." The mention of George's name sent a visible ripple through the crowd. Heads turned, conversations stopped, and George suddenly found himself the center of attention in a way he hadn't experienced since his competitive retirement. "Mr. Ford," the tournament director approached him with obvious excitement. "We had no idea you were actively coaching again. This is quite remarkable. Tommy's play today has been exceptional." George felt the weight of multiple conversations happening simultaneously around him. Parents were asking about private lessons, coaches were inquiring about his teaching methods, and tournament officials were discussing the possibility of special recognition for Tommy's performance. But through it all, George's attention remained focused on Tommy. He could see him beginning to realize that he was at the center of something much larger than a simple chess tournament. The boy who had approached him in the park 6 months ago, asking quietly if he could teach him chess, was now being discussed as a potential prodigy by some of the most knowledgeable chess minds in the region. As the crowd around Tommy continued to grow, George made his way through the group and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "How are you feeling?" he asked quietly. Tommy looked up at him with eyes that seemed older than they had that morning. "George, I think I'm in trouble." "What do you mean?" "Look at them," Tommy said, gesturing subtly at the crowd of adults surrounding them. "They're all staring at me like I'm some kind of freak. Like I did something impossible." George felt his heart clench. He recognized the look in Tommy's eyes. The same bewilderment and slight fear he had experienced as a young player when people first began treating him differently because of his chess ability. "Tommy," he said firmly, "you did do something impossible. You played chess today at a level that most people spend years trying to reach. But that doesn't make you a freak, it makes you gifted." "But what if I can't do it again?" Tommy's voice dropped to a whisper. "What if this was just luck, and next tournament I play like a beginner, and everybody realizes I'm not really special?" George knelt down so he was at Tommy's eye level, ignoring the conversation swirling around them. "Tommy, listen to me carefully. What happened today wasn't luck. You've been playing chess for 6 months. And in that time, you've absorbed concepts that take most players years to understand. You see patterns and combinations that your opponents miss, because your mind processes chess in a way that's genuinely extraordinary. He paused, making sure he had Tommy's full attention. But more importantly, even if you never won another game, even if you plateaued right here and never improved another point, you would still be exactly the same person you were this morning, intelligent, thoughtful, and worthy of respect and opportunity. Tommy nodded slowly, and George could see some of the tension leave his shoulders. Now, George continued, standing back up, you have one more round to play today, and I want you to play it exactly the way you played the first four, with confidence, creativity, and the knowledge that you belong here just as much as anyone else. As they walked back toward the tournament boards for the final round, George reflected on how much had changed since that morning in Riverside Park when a lonely boy had asked him to teach him chess. Tommy had crossed a threshold today, not just in terms of chess skill, but in terms of self-perception and possibility. The boy who had been scheduled for transfer to a group home for challenging cases was now being discussed as a potential chess prodigy by some of the most respected figures in the chess world. But George knew that the real victory wasn't in the games Tommy had won or even in the recognition he was receiving. The real victory was in the moment he had just witnessed, when a child who had learned to expect disappointment chose instead to believe in his own extraordinary potential. Tommy's final round opponent was David Kim, a 17-year-old who had been competing in serious tournaments for 8 years and was considered one of the strongest junior players in the region. As they sat down at the board, George could see the mix of curiosity and skepticism in David's expression. He had clearly heard about the mysterious first-time player who was having an extraordinary tournament, but he wasn't quite ready to believe the reports were accurate. "So you're the kid everyone's talking about," David said as they set up their pieces. 4 wins in your first tournament. That's pretty impressive." "Thank you," Tommy replied politely, but George could see the focused concentration already settling over his features. The nervousness and self-doubt he had expressed earlier were gone, replaced by the calm intensity that had characterized his play all day. George took his seat in the spectator area, aware that a larger crowd than usual had gathered to watch this final round game. Word of Tommy's performance had spread beyond the tournament hall, and several local chess masters who weren't officially participating had arrived to observe the conclusion of what was already being called one of the most remarkable debuts in regional chess history. The stage was set for Tommy to prove that his extraordinary day wasn't a fluke, that the boy from Maplewood Children's Home truly belonged among the elite young players in the country. Part 10, the final test. Dr. Morrison settled into the seat beside George, his notebook open and pen ready. "I've been analyzing the games Tommy's played today," he said quietly. "George, his tactical vision is certainly impressive, but what's even more remarkable is his positional understanding. He's making moves that show deep comprehension of pawn structures and piece coordination, concepts that usually take years to master." George nodded, watching Tommy settle into his pre-game routine. He had taught him to spend a few moments before each game visualizing the upcoming battle, centering himself and calling up the principles they had studied together. "The most extraordinary thing," George replied, "is that he's been developing this understanding organically. I show him a principle, and he doesn't just memorize it. He internalizes it and finds new ways to apply it in positions we've never studied." David played 1.d4, opting for a more positional opening than the tactical complications that had characterized Tommy's earlier games. George could see the strategy. David was clearly hoping to steer the game into the kind of subtle, technical endgame where experience and theoretical knowledge would give him an advantage over raw talent. Tommy considered the position for several minutes before responding with an f6, a solid but flexible move that kept his options open. George felt a surge of approval. Tommy was showing the patience and strategic thinking that separated good players from merely tactical ones. As the game progressed, George began to see something he hadn't expected. David was indeed a strong, experienced player, but he was playing with the kind of mechanical precision that came from years of following established patterns, without necessarily understanding the deeper principles behind them. Tommy, by contrast, was playing with the creative freedom that came from truly understanding what each piece was trying to accomplish. On move 12, Tommy played a move that caused a visible stir in the watching crowd. He advanced his h-pawn 2 squares, a move that looked like a beginner's mistake, weakening his king position for no apparent reason. David smiled slightly, clearly thinking he had discovered a flaw in the young prodigy's play. He immediately launched an attack against Tommy's apparently weakened king side, bringing his pieces forward with obvious confidence. But George could see what David had missed, and he felt a thrill of recognition as Tommy's strategy began to unfold. The pawn advance hadn't been a mistake. It had been the first move in a deeply calculated plan that would transform apparent weakness into overwhelming strength. Over the next 10 moves, Tommy systematically repositioned his pieces while David's attack foundered against what turned out to be an impregnable defense. Then, just as David was beginning to realize that his assault had failed, Tommy launched a devastating counterattack on the opposite side of the board. The combination that followed was so brilliant that George heard several of the watching masters murmur in appreciation. Tommy sacrificed a full rook, a significant material investment, to expose David's king and create an unstoppable mating attack. The calculation required to see all the ramifications was extraordinary, particularly for someone playing in his first tournament. David stared at the board for nearly 10 minutes, clearly hoping to find some defensive resource that would allow him to continue fighting. But Tommy's attack was mathematically precise. Every possible escape route had been anticipated and blocked. Finally, David extended his hand in resignation. "That was brilliant," he said, and George could hear genuine admiration beneath his disappointment. "I've never seen anyone find that combination so quickly." "Thank you," Tommy replied, his voice steady despite the excitement George could see in his eyes. "You played really well, too." As the two players completed their post-game analysis, George became aware of the conversations taking place around him. The watching masters were discussing Tommy's play with the kind of reverent attention usually reserved for games by world-class grandmasters. "That rook sacrifice was worthy of Tal," he heard one of them say, referring to the legendary Soviet chess genius known for his brilliant combinations. "The positional understanding is even more impressive," another replied. "That pawn advance on move 12, I've seen grandmasters miss that kind of subtle preparation." Dr. Morrison turned to George with an expression of amazement. "George, I need to ask you directly, how much theory have you taught him? How extensively have you worked on tactical patterns and endgame technique?" George considered the question carefully. "We've covered basic opening principles and fundamental endgame positions, but mostly I've focused on helping him understand the logic behind chess moves. Why pieces work better on certain squares, how to recognize when positions are ripe for tactical combinations, how to formulate and execute long-term plans." "And he's absorbed all of this in 6 months?" "He's absorbed it and built on it," George corrected. "Some of the moves he played today weren't things I specifically taught him. They were applications of principles we discussed, but applied in ways that showed genuine creativity and understanding." Dr. Morrison was quiet for a moment, clearly processing what he had witnessed. "George, I hope you understand what you've discovered here. Natural talent at this level is extraordinarily rare. With proper training and competitive experience, Tommy could potentially reach master strength within a few years." George felt a complex mixture of pride and protectiveness as he watched Tommy patiently answering questions from tournament officials and fellow players. 6 months ago, he had been a lonely boy in a children's home, convinced that his circumstances defined his limitations. Now he was being discussed as a potential chess prodigy by some of the most knowledgeable figures in the chess world. But what struck George most was Tommy's demeanor throughout the post-game discussions. Despite the praise and attention, he remained grounded and humble, more interested in learning from his opponents than in basking in their admiration. It was exactly the attitude that would serve him well as he continued to develop his extraordinary gift. As the tournament concluded and prizes were awarded, Tommy found himself holding the trophy for first place in his section, an achievement that would have seemed impossible when he woke up that morning. But George could see that the real prize wasn't the trophy itself, but the knowledge that he had tested himself against serious competition and discovered that his potential was even greater than either of them had dared to hope. The watching crowd erupted in applause as Tommy's name was announced as the tournament winner. George saw several photographers capturing the moment, and he knew that by tomorrow, word of this remarkable debut would have spread throughout the chess community. Mr. Ford, the tournament director, approached George as the ceremonies concluded. "I hope you realize what a special day this has been. Tommy's performance will be talked about for years to come." George nodded, but his attention was focused on Tommy, who was surrounded by well-wishers and fellow players offering their congratulations. The boy handled each interaction with grace and genuine gratitude, showing no trace of arrogance despite his extraordinary achievement. Dr. Morrison appeared at George's side once more, his expression serious. "George, I need to make you an offer. The Grandmaster Academy would be honored to have Tommy as a student. Full scholarship, access to our strongest coaches, preparation for national and international competitions." George felt his protective instincts flare. "Richard, I appreciate the offer, but Tommy's education is about more than just chess. He needs stability, consistency." "Of course," Dr. Morrison interrupted. "We wouldn't dream of disrupting his current living situation or his relationship with you. This would be supplementary training, weekend intensives, summer programs, access to our resources when he's ready for them." George looked across the room at Tommy, who was demonstrating the final position of his game against David to a group of younger players. The boy's eyes were bright with enthusiasm as he explained the tactical ideas behind his rook sacrifice. "Let me discuss it with Tommy," George said finally. "This is his decision to make." As they prepared to leave the tournament hall, Tommy approached George with a mixture of excitement and bewilderment, still visible in his expression. "George," he said quietly, "6 months ago, if someone had told me I'd win a chess tournament, I would have thought they were crazy. And now?" Tommy was quiet for a moment, looking around the tournament hall where workers were already breaking down the boards and equipment. "Now I'm starting to understand what you meant when you said chess could change everything. But George? Yes? No matter how far this goes, no matter what happens next, I want you to know that the best part wasn't winning the tournament. The best part was discovering that I'm capable of things I never imagined." George felt a profound sense of completion as they walked out of the community center together. The boy who had asked him to teach chess had indeed become something extraordinary, not just a chess player, but a young man who understood that his potential was limitless. The journey that had begun with a simple request in Riverside Park had taken them both further than either had dreamed possible. And somehow, George knew this was still just the beginning. Part 11. The Davidson Foundation and New Horizons. 3 days after the tournament, George's phone rang with the call he had been both expecting and anticipating. The number displayed was from the Davidson Foundation, and George knew that what happened in the next few minutes would determine the trajectory of Tommy's future in ways that went far beyond their morning chess lessons in the park. "Mr. Ford, this is Margaret Davidson from the Davidson Foundation. I hope you remember our conversation from last week regarding young Tommy Brennan." "Of course," George replied, settling into his most comfortable chair. "I trust you've had a chance to review the materials I sent regarding Tommy's potential?" There was a pause, and George could hear papers rustling in the background. "Mr. Ford, I have to confess that when you first contacted us about this boy, I was somewhat skeptical. We receive many requests for scholarships, and claims about exceptional talent are often overstated." George felt his heart sink slightly, but he forced his voice to remain calm. "I understand your caution." "However," Margaret continued, and George could hear the excitement creeping into her voice, "after reviewing the games from Tommy's tournament performance and consulting with several of our advisory board members who are international masters, I can honestly say that we have never encountered a first-time tournament player who demonstrated such extraordinary ability." George closed his eyes, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. "So the foundation is interested in supporting Tommy's development?" "Mr. Ford, we're not just interested. We're prepared to offer Tommy the most comprehensive scholarship package in our foundation's history. Full tuition to our summer intensive program, private coaching with one of our Grandmaster instructors, and if his development continues at this rate, potential sponsorship for international youth competitions." George felt tears of joy prick at the corners of his eyes. "Margaret, that's incredibly generous. But I should mention that Tommy's circumstances are somewhat complex. He's currently a ward of the state, living in a children's home." "We're aware of his situation," Margaret replied warmly. "In fact, it only strengthens our commitment to supporting him. The foundation was established specifically to provide opportunities for gifted children who might not otherwise have access to elite coaching and competitive experience." George thought of Tommy, currently at school, and completely unaware that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't imagine. When would the foundation like to meet with Tommy? "Actually, Mr. Ford, we were hoping you might bring Tommy to our facility this Saturday. We'd like to conduct a more formal assessment, meet with him personally, and discuss the full scope of what we're prepared to offer." After hanging up, George sat in his quiet apartment, marveling at how completely his own life had transformed in the past 6 months. He had begun teaching Tommy chess as a way to fill his empty retirement days, but he had discovered something far more valuable, a sense of purpose that had been missing since he left competitive play. That afternoon, George made his way to Maplewood Children's Home, where Mrs. Patterson was waiting with a smile that seemed to light up the entire building. "George," Mrs. Patterson said, embracing him warmly, "I can't thank you enough for what you've done for Tommy. The change in him has been absolutely remarkable." "Where is he?" "In the common room, teaching some of the other children how to play chess." "George, you should see him. He's like a completely different boy than he was 6 months ago." George followed Mrs. Patterson down the familiar hallway to the common room, where he found Tommy sitting at a table with 5 younger children, patiently explaining the basic movements of chess pieces. His face was animated with enthusiasm, and George could see the confidence and sense of purpose that had replaced the resignation and wariness that had characterized him when they first met. "Tommy," Mrs. Patterson called, "George is here to see you." Tommy looked up with a smile that transformed his entire face. "George, perfect timing. I was just showing Marcus how the knight moves in an L shape. He's getting really good at it." He gestured to an 8-year-old boy who was carefully moving a knight around the board. "I think he might be even better than I was when I started." George felt a warm glow of recognition as he watched Tommy interact with the younger children. He was exhibiting the same patience and clear explanation that characterized the best chess teachers, taking complex concepts and breaking them down into manageable pieces that young minds could grasp. "Tommy," George said, approaching the table, "could I speak with you privately for a moment?" Tommy excused himself from his impromptu chess lesson and followed George to a quieter corner of the room. "Is everything okay? You look like you have something really important to tell me." George sat down across from him, marveling at how much he had matured in just the few days since the tournament. The boy who had once been afraid to hope for good things now carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had discovered his own capabilities. "Tommy, I just received a call from the Davidson Foundation. They've reviewed your tournament games, and they want to meet with you this Saturday." Tommy's eyes widened with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "The scholarship people? They really want to meet me?" "Really?" "And Tommy, from what Margaret Davidson told me, they're prepared to offer you opportunities that could change your entire future. Elite coaching, summer programs, access to international competitions, and potentially sponsorship for travel to tournaments around the world." Tommy was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the same thoughtful analysis he brought to complex chess positions. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a maturity that surprised George. "6 months ago, if someone had told me that chess organizations would be competing to sponsor me, I would have thought they were completely insane," Tommy said slowly. "But George, I need to ask you something important." "What's that?" Tommy looked directly at him with an expression that seemed far older than his 13 years. "Will you still be my coach? I mean, if I get this scholarship and start working with grandmasters and going to fancy chess academies and traveling to international tournaments, will you still want to teach me?" George felt his heart clench at the vulnerability in Tommy's voice. Despite all his newfound confidence and recognition, he was still fundamentally the lonely boy who had learned not to trust that good things would last. "Tommy," George said firmly, reaching across and placing his hand on the boy's shoulder, "I will be your coach for as long as you want me to be. Elite programs and grandmaster instructors can teach you advanced theory and tournament technique, but what we have, the understanding we've built together, the way we approach chess as a language of possibility, that's something unique and valuable that no one can replace." Tommy's face broke into the radiant smile that never failed to remind George why he had fallen in love with teaching him. "So we're still a team?" "We're still a team," George confirmed, "now and always. But Tommy, there's something else you need to understand about what's happening to you." "What do you mean?" George gestured toward the younger children who were still gathered around the chessboard, trying to continue their lesson without Tommy's guidance. "Look at those kids. A month ago, none of them knew how chess pieces moved. Now they're playing games, solving puzzles, thinking strategically about problems. You did that, Tommy. You took what I taught you and found a way to share it with others." Tommy followed George's gaze, watching as 8-year-old Marcus successfully executed a simple tactical combination against his 10-year-old sister. "That's what real chess mastery looks like," George continued. "It's not just about winning tournaments or earning ratings. It's about understanding the game so deeply that you can pass that understanding on to others, inspire them to see possibilities they never knew existed." Tommy nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his expression. "Like what you did for me. Exactly like what I did for you. And Tommy, what you're learning to do for these kids, that's going to serve you well no matter how far your chess career takes you." Champions come and go, but teachers change lives forever. Mrs. Patterson approached them with a folder in her hands and an expression of barely contained excitement. "George, I just received some wonderful news. The state has approved a special educational enhancement program for Tommy. It will allow him to participate in advanced chess training while maintaining his residence here at Maplewood, and it includes provisions for travel to tournaments." George felt a surge of satisfaction that was both personal and professional. 6 months ago, Mrs. Whitmore had tried to transfer Tommy to a facility for challenging cases because she viewed his chess ambitions as problematic behavior. Now, the same state system was bending over backwards to accommodate his extraordinary talent. "There's more," Mrs. Patterson continued with a grin. "The local newspaper wants to do a follow-up story about Tommy's tournament victory. They're calling it 'From Foster Care to Chess Champion: The Continued Journey of a Local Prodigy.'" Tommy looked thoughtful about this development. "Do you think that's a good idea? I mean, what if other kids see the article and think chess is only for people who are naturally good at it?" George felt a profound surge of pride at Tommy's question. Even in the midst of his own success, the boy was thinking about how his story might affect others, specifically how it might either inspire or discourage young people who were facing their own challenges. "Actually, Tommy, I think that's exactly why you should do the interview," George said. "Your story isn't about being naturally gifted. It's about what happens when someone with curiosity and determination gets the right opportunities and support. That's a message that could inspire a lot of kids who feel like their circumstances limit their possibilities." Tommy nodded slowly, understanding the broader implications of his journey. "You mean, show them that you don't have to come from a chess family or have expensive equipment to discover you're good at something important." "Exactly. You're living proof that talent exists everywhere, and that with the right mentorship and opportunities, any young person can achieve extraordinary things." As George prepared to leave Maplewood that afternoon, he reflected on how far they had both traveled from that first morning in Riverside Park. Tommy's transformation had been remarkable, but George's own journey had been equally profound. He had rediscovered his passion for chess, his sense of purpose, and his connection to something larger than personal achievement. Tomorrow they would visit the Davidson Foundation together, and Tommy would take the next step in a chess journey that was already exceeding everyone's expectations. But tonight, George simply wanted to savor the knowledge that he had kept his promise to the lonely boy who had asked him to teach chess. The foundation meeting would open new doors, but the most important work had already been done. Tommy had learned to believe in himself, to see possibilities where others saw only limitations, and to approach challenges with the strategic thinking and creative problem-solving that chess had taught him. Most importantly, he had learned that his circumstances didn't define his potential, and that lesson would serve him well no matter where his extraordinary journey led next. Part 12. The Circle Complete. 6 months later, George stood in the lobby of the International Chess Center in New York City, watching Tommy prepare for the most important game of his young life. The National Youth Championship Final, a competition that would determine not just a title, but Tommy's ranking among the elite junior players in the country. He looked remarkably composed for a 14-year-old about to play for a national championship, but George could see the focused intensity in his eyes that had become his trademark in crucial moments. Over the past months of intensive training with the Davidson Foundation, Tommy had grown not just as a chess player, but as a young man who understood both his extraordinary gifts and the responsibilities they carried. "How do you feel?" George asked as they found seats in the designated coaching area. "Ready," Tommy replied simply, and George marveled at the quiet confidence in his voice. "All the work we've done, all the preparation, it's led to this moment." George thought back to their journey together. From that first morning in Riverside Park when Tommy had nervously asked him to teach him chess, through the crisis with Mrs. Whitmore, his remarkable tournament debut, and the months of intensive study that had followed his Davidson Foundation scholarship. Tommy had proven to be everything George had hoped, and more. His natural talent had flourished under proper instruction, but more importantly, he had retained the humility and love of learning that had characterized him from the beginning. Despite recognition from grandmasters and invitations to elite chess academies around the world, Tommy still returned to Maplewood Children's Home every evening, still spent time teaching chess to the younger kids, still approached each new challenge with the thoughtful analysis that George had taught him. The Davidson Foundation program had been transformative. Tommy had spent his summer training with international masters, had competed in tournaments across 3 countries, and had been invited to join the U.S. Junior National Team Development Program. But through it all, he had remained grounded, never forgetting where he came from, or the people who had believed in him when no one else would. "Tommy," George said as they watched other young players preparing for their games, "regardless of what happens today, I want you to know how proud I am of the player and the person you've become." Tommy smiled, the expression transforming his face in the way that never failed to remind George of why he had originally been drawn to help him. "George, can I tell you something?" "Always. Sometimes I think about that morning when I asked you to teach me chess. I was so scared that you'd say no, that you'd think I wasn't worth your time." Tommy paused, looking around the impressive tournament hall filled with the strongest junior players in the country. "I never imagined that saying yes to those chess lessons would lead to all this." George felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. "Tommy, you weren't just asking me to teach you chess that morning. You were asking me to believe in you, to see possibilities that others had missed. Teaching you hasn't just changed your life, it's changed mine too." "How?" George considered the question, thinking about the man he had been 6 months ago. Retired, isolated, feeling as though his greatest accomplishments were behind him. "You reminded me that chess isn't just about competition or personal achievement. It's about passing on knowledge, opening doors for others, using whatever gifts we have to help people reach their potential." The tournament director called for players to take their seats, and Tommy stood up with the calm purposefulness that had become second nature to him. But before heading to his board, he turned back to George with a mischievous smile that reminded him of the curious boy who had first approached him in the park. "George, after I win this tournament, can we go back to Riverside Park and play a game on that old bench where it all started?" George laughed, feeling a surge of the competitive joy that had defined his championship years. "After you win this tournament, I'll play you anywhere you want, but don't think I'm going to make it easy for you just because you're a national champion." "I wouldn't want you to," Tommy replied with a grin. "That wouldn't be any fun." As George watched Tommy walk to his board, Board 1, where the top-rated player in the tournament faced his final opponent, he reflected on the extraordinary transformation he had witnessed. The boy who had once believed his circumstances defined his limitations was now competing at the highest level of junior chess, his name already being mentioned alongside the most promising young players in the world. Tommy's final opponent was Kevin Walsh, a 16-year-old from California who had been dominating junior chess for 3 years. As the 2 players shook hands and began their pre-game preparations, George could see the respect in Kevin's eyes. Tommy's rapid rise through the chess world had earned him the admiration of even his most accomplished peers. The game that followed was a masterpiece of strategic chess, with both players demonstrating the kind of deep understanding and creative thinking that separated elite players from merely strong ones. Tommy played with the patient, methodical approach George had taught him, building small advantages and converting them into larger ones through precise technique and tactical alertness. George found himself analyzing the position with the same intensity he had brought to his own championship games, but with a different kind of emotional investment. This wasn't about his own glory or legacy. This was about watching someone he cared about achieve their dreams through talent, hard work, and the kind of support that every gifted child deserved. When Tommy finally achieved the winning position, a complex endgame that required 40 moves of precise calculation, George felt a pride that surpassed anything he had experienced during his own championship years. This wasn't just about chess excellence. It was about a young person realizing his extraordinary potential despite circumstances that could have easily crushed his dreams. As Tommy's opponent resigned and the hall erupted in applause, George made his way through the crowd to congratulate his student, though he knew that Tommy had long since become much more than a student. He had become living proof that talent and determination could overcome any obstacle, that the right mentor at the right moment could change a life completely. "So," Tommy said as George reached him, his face radiant with joy and accomplishment, "are you ready for that game in Riverside Park?" George hugged him tightly, feeling the weight of their shared journey and the promise of adventures still to come. "Tommy Brennan, I thought you'd never ask." But before they could leave the tournament hall, they were approached by a familiar figure. Mrs. Whitmore stood before them, looking dramatically different from the stern bureaucrat who had tried to transfer Tommy to Millfield a year ago. Her expression was one of amazement and something that might have been shame. "Tommy," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology. And Mr. Ford, I owe you my gratitude. I was wrong about everything. About chess, about Tommy's potential, about what children in state custody could achieve." Tommy, showing the maturity that had come to characterize him, extended his hand. "Mrs. Whitmore, thank you for coming. I hope you'll visit us at Maplewood sometime. We have 12 kids in our chess program now, and they're all doing amazing things." Mrs. Whitmore shook his hand with obvious emotion. "I would be honored to visit. And Tommy, I want you to know that your story has changed how our entire department thinks about enrichment programs for children in care. You've opened doors for kids who haven't even been born yet." As they finally left the tournament hall together, the retired chess champion and the boy he had taught to believe in himself, George knew that their story was far from over. Tommy would continue to grow as a player, and as a person, would face new challenges and achieve new victories. The scholarship offers were already pouring in from universities around the world, and his name was being mentioned as a potential candidate for the U.S. Olympic team. But no matter how far his chess career took him, he would always be the boy who had approached a lonely man in a park and asked if he could teach him chess. And George would always be the teacher who had discovered that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating opponents across a chessboard, but from helping someone else discover the extraordinary potential that was inside them all along. 3 hours later, they sat on the familiar bench in Riverside Park, the same spot where their journey had begun a year ago. George had brought his old wooden chess set, the one with pieces worn smooth from decades of tournament play. Tommy had insisted on setting up the position himself, his movements sure and confident. "Your move," Tommy said, settling back on the bench with a smile. George studied the position, not the chessboard but the young man sitting across from him, the withdrawn, frightened boy who had been scheduled for transfer to a group home for challenging cases was gone, replaced by a national champion who understood that his greatest victory wasn't any tournament he had won, but the example he had set for other children who dared to dream beyond their circumstances. "Actually," George said, reaching across to clasp Tommy's hand, "I think we both already won." The autumn leaves drifted down around them like discarded pieces from some cosmic game, and in the distance they could hear the laughter of children playing on the swings. Somewhere among them, George knew, was probably another lonely kid with a spark of curiosity and a dream that seemed impossible. The pawns had indeed become queens, just as George had promised. And the game, the beautiful infinite game of helping others discover their potential, would continue as long as there were teachers willing to say yes and students brave enough to ask. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.